when you say, okay, we're going to take this app that you like most, where you express your political views, where you get your access to information, and we're going to ban it. We're not going to let you use it. It's no longer going to exist in this country the way X doesn't exist in Brazil.
And this isn't just about Elon Musk. It's not just about failing to have a registered agent. There's something happening here. There's a first generation of free speech, of empowerment on the internet. And these established gatekeepers now are working hard to get control of it. Brazil's the latest example.
Brendan Carr is a former communications lawyer. He now serves as a Trump-appointed commissioner on the Federal Communications Commission, which is the federal agency charged with regulating media and communications. Unusually for an FCC commissioner, he has been quite outspoken about several matters of public debate, including his opposition to big tech censorship, which he has been very steadfast on, the censorship specifically imposed around the COVID discourse, and most recently he has been quite outspoken in opposition to the decision by one judge in Brazil to ban X in the entire country as a result of X's failures to comply with a whole variety of unjust censorship orders. He has also at the same time been one of the leaders urging the banning of TikTok on national security grounds, and he plays a very important role in all these issues. He's not a pundit. He's an actual commissioner on the FCC, and for that reason, we are excited to speak with him tonight. Mr. Carr, welcome to our show. It's great to speak with you. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, and thanks for all your work over the years. Really appreciate your insights and perspectives.
Yeah, I feel very much the same way. So let me start by asking you, what is it that motivated you? Because usually FCC commissioners are pretty obscure. They're regulators. They're people who work in behind the scenes agencies. You've decided to kind of use this platform to speak out principally in defense of free speech and in opposition to big tech censorship, online censorship from wherever it comes from. What kind of motivated you to do that? And what is it that the FCC can do about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. At the FCC, there's 5 of us that are commissioners, 3 are of the president's party. So right now we have 3 that are Democrats. You have 2 that are Republicans. As you noted, I was originally nominated by President Trump back in 2017. It was actually renominated by President Biden last year because you have to have Republicans on the commission. And so every commissioner is independent. We are outside of the administration. That gives us a lot of freedom and leeway to pick and choose the issues that we focus on. And one of them that I've been very focused on over the years is this really sort of recent, or the last couple of years, surge in censorship. We see it domestically in the U.S. and we see it abroad as well. In fact, I think one of the first times I think you and I crossed paths was when a number of Democrats in Congress were writing letters to cable companies urging them to drop Fox News and Newsmax based on the political perspectives of the newsrooms there. We saw other efforts where there was a license transfer of a radio station in South Florida going to perceived conservative buyers, and Democrats wrote the FCC and suggested that we should block it on that basis. And so I've tried to sort of speak out where I see that taking place. And recently in Brazil, it fits that, and we can unpack it. It's part of this, global surge in censorship, but also I think it's a really concerning authoritarian trend in Brazil that should give businesses across the board a lot of concern. This isn't just about Elon Musk. It's not just about failing to have a registered agent. There's something happening here that we can unpack that I think, like Bill Ackman said, is putting Brazil on the path to becoming uninvestable.
Yeah, I definitely want to delve a little bit more into the Brazil case. Obviously, as I'm sure you know, we are based in Brazil. It's kind of amazing that if we want to watch our own show or transmit our own show on Rumble, which is no longer available in Brazil for similar reasons, we have to use a VPN to do it. Obviously, have to use a VPN if we want to access X, even though somehow this judge invented a law that is now a criminal offense to do so, and you have to pay $10,000, $9,000 a day if you are caught doing so. But for those of us who have lived with the internet for a long time, who remember its emergence in our lives and sort of the incipient stages, the key attribute of the internet that made it so exciting and innovative as a technology was that it was free, meaning you could speak anonymously or under your own name. You could have privacy on it. No one could surveil you or find you or trace you. That, most importantly, no centralized corporate or state power could regulate the kinds of things that you could say. It was the innovation was this was going to be an instrument to enable citizens around the world to trade information, to talk to each other, to organize, to transmit information without having to rely on big media corporations and without having to be subject to government approval. In your mind, I think the internet was that for quite a long time. But in your mind, when did this censorship ethos or system begin to emerge as a system, and what is it that you think caused it?
Yeah, look, I think a couple. I think you're exactly right. I think if you go back to 2012, there was a real rise in free speech on the internet. In fact, President Obama went to Facebook's Silicon Valley headquarters back in 2012 and gave a speech where he said the free flow of information on the internet is key to, in his words, a healthy democracy. And then flash forward 10 years and a few short miles down the road, President Obama gave a speech in 2022 at Stanford. And he talked about the threats that come from the free flow of information and talked about it as being a potential threat to democracy. So if you look at the bookends there of 2012 to 2022, something very fundamental, as you noted, has changed. We used to view free speech in the internet. In fact, America itself, whether it was, free speech over any modern means of communication, Radio Free Asia, we embraced free speech during a lot of the sort of 2010, 2012 global unrest when we viewed it as a tool to take down authoritarians. And then I think something happened in 2016, right around Brexit, right around the election of President Trump. There's a very clear shift that people said, you know what, maybe this free speech on the internet thing is not compatible with the outcomes that we want to see at the ballot box. And so something has changed fundamentally, and all of those powers that were at play to promote free speech, to undermine authoritarian regimes, have sort of turned those jets into reverse. And I think you're seeing globally this coming back of control over free speech. And again, even go back even further. The modern day op-ed launched on the pages of the New York Times in 1970s. And there was an editor at the time, John Oakes, and he said, diversity of opinion is the lifeblood of democracy. The moment we insist that everybody think the same way we do, our democratic way of life is in jeopardy. Of course, flash forward now 50 years, and New York Times op-ed page, had people fired over running a free speech piece, the Tom Cotton op-ed. So I think you put your finger on it. There was a first generation of free speech, of empowerment on the internet, and these established gatekeepers now are working hard to get control of it. Brazil's the latest example.
You played a major role in the debate around whether the U.S. should ban TikTok or force a sale to a company not connected to or controlled by China. And I want to get to that in just a minute. But before I get to that, you might have heard, I think, at the end of, right before you came on, I was talking about the incident last year where a bunch of people on TikTok, younger people, had discovered something that they didn't know had existed, which was this bin Laden letter, where he purported to explain why there was so much anti-Americanism in the region. And they were kind of shocked to have learned about this letter because it contained a lot of things that they had never heard before, that they had never thought about before, that they had never known existed. And they began debating it and talking about it quite a bit, and especially in connection with the current U.S. support for the Israeli war in Gaza. And what happened, as you know, I think, is that there was a lot of pressure on TikTok to ban discussions of that letter. The Guardian was coerced into removing it from their site, so they took down this document that, whatever you think of it, has historical importance. And then TikTok did end up banning any discussion of the bin Laden letter. The hashtags about it, the link no longer worked. With regard to that incident, did you see that as a similarly repressive and dangerous act of censorship, or did you see some sort of noble aspect to that?
Look, there's a Supreme Court case that goes back, I believe, to the 1950s. It's a Postmaster General case, and it establishes the fact that Americans have a First Amendment right to seek out and obtain foreign propaganda or information the government labels as foreign propaganda. That was a case that involved a newsletter called at the time the Peking Review. It still exists today. It's called the Beijing Review. And Americans have the right to seek that foreign propaganda out, and the government can't stop it. And so I think the TikTok debate as a general matter is really interesting because I think it draws a line between government action based on conduct, which we can get into in that case, or government action based on content. And I think if you're taking action against TikTok because you don't like that the bin Laden letter was circulating on there, I think that is not just sort of wrong as a policy matter, but that's a First Amendment problem. And again, I think if you look at what's happening in Brazil with X, and again, we'll stay with TikTok here, but if you look at Brazil and X, the Brazilian government is expressly saying that we are taking action against X because of the content of the speech that's out there. So the issue that I think a lot of people legitimately have with TikTok is its conduct. It was engaged in certain actions that we can talk about that are distinguishable from speech. There's some cases where maybe it's close. I think the tie goes in favor of not taking government action in those cases. But I think, in my view, TikTok was so far beyond legitimate conduct that we can get into that was a basis for action. But yeah, to your point, the bin Laden video and that circulating is not a permissible basis for the government to take action. Americans have that right.
Right, but what about
seek
the
out
pressure on The Guardian and TikTok to take action to prevent it? Not necessarily even from the government, but from journalists, from influential people saying this can't be permitted, take this down, don't let this conversation ensue. Is that something that bothered you, even independent of the question of state action?
Yeah, I mean, look, my view, I think it's perfectly fine for people to have debate and say, look, me, private sector person, I don't think that this is a good thing for you to be showing. That debate can take place. But I'm not a big fan of sort of these, pressure campaigns to silence speech. I think if consenting adults want to have a conversation about something, they should. I mean, my view is not that this is like that Sandra Bullock movie Bird Box, where you got to like hold everybody's eyes open and compel them to see and read speech that they don't like or don't want to. But at the same time, if two consenting adults want to access information, they should be free to do so. So I would sort of put it in three buckets. One, the government shouldn't step in and pressure in that circumstance. Two, the private sector can have debates and there can be these sort of protests, there can be ad boycotts. I don't love that. But I think sort of the third piece of it is we shouldn't go so far as making it as impossible for consenting adults to be debating any topic. Again, debating ideas, that goes to the heart of how we solve our biggest problems. Let's spin it around. Let's think about it. It's silencing speech that leads us into difficulties. We saw it with COVID. And so I think that's the problem. We should allow consenting adults to have these conversations.
As a cinematic reference for holding people's eyes open forcibly and forcing them to ingest content, I probably would have referred to the Clockwork Orange, but maybe we're just revealing our respective ages in that difference. All right, let's go to Brazil, because I've lived in Brazil for 20 years. I have a lot of connections to this country. My children are Brazilian. I care a lot about what's happening here and its future. And I definitely agree with you that the attempt by the Brazilian government to ban acts is an extreme escalation of authoritarianism. The fact that it was not even done by Congress, but by a single judge who at the same time invented this criminalization of VPNs is something that, banning acts is something that exists in about 7 countries. It's not a very glamorous list to be added to. So I agree with you on that. But I've spent a lot of time talking to and arguing with and debating Brazilians who favor this move by Alexandre de Moraes in the court. And their argument sounds a lot to me like your argument sounds about the U.S. banning of TikTok. I understand the distinction you drew, which is the banning of TikTok is not about the content of speech, but about the conduct of the company. But the Brazilians who favor the banning of acts will say that Elon Musk is a foreigner who is trying to use his power and influence to disseminate pro-Bolsonaro, pro-far right-wing propaganda in our country. And in order to protect our sovereignty, in order to not allow some foreigner to dictate to us what information our citizens are swamped with, we're not taking action because we don't like the speech. We're taking action because it's a matter of our sovereignty, which sounds a lot to me like the argument in favor of the U.S. banning TikTok. How do you distinguish those two?
Yeah, I think it's a fair question and critique to ask me to sort of discuss those two cases and how I've come out so differently. And I think these two examples are sort of perfect ways of delineating this distinction between conduct on the one hand and content. And I'll start really briefly with TikTok. So the type of conduct that we're talking about is very different than the type of conduct arguably being addressed by Justice de Moraes. In TikTok, I'll just run through this really quickly because I think it's a great example. This started with their cybersecurity expert, one of their C-suite officials, saying that U.S. user data doesn't even exist inside China. And then we got inside leaked materials that showed, in fact, quote, everything is seen in China. So it was about conduct of this data transferring that they'd misrepresented. And so there was this track record of the conduct that I'm talking about being the actual physical transfer of data back to China. You can argue whether that's sort of a good or bad thing, but they were plainly, repeatedly engaged in misrepresentations along those lines that undermined our faith in them from a national security perspective. Now, that's very different than what's taking place in Brazil with X. There's no claim at all that X is somehow collecting data that it shouldn't be and transferring. It's not conduct in that sense. What they're saying is that we are worried that free speech on X will result in people engaging in conduct in our country, which is, two very different conceptions of the word conduct. And in particular, if you look at Justice de Moraes, what he says is that we're worried about the incitement of anti-democratic acts. And it's funny because he's sort of scratching at a concept that's in U.S. law, which we have sort of incitement to violence as sort of an exception to our protection for free speech, but violence is an unlawful act. What he means, when you read his decision, incitement to anti-democratic acts, he then goes on to say, is voting the wrong way. And so that sort of makes this very fundamentally different. They're concerned about the content that people are reading on X, as opposed to the concerns I had on TikTok, which is not having to do with the content. Go ahead and have the bin Laden video up there. It was about the obtaining of this data and the transferring of it. And so I think these cases are actually really good at highlighting the line that I think exists. But I don't fault anybody that reasonably looks at all this and says, it's just too much for me. There's too much censorship going on. This is too fine a line that you're drawing in my view. And I think a reasonable person can come to that conclusion, and I respect that view.
What TikTok basically is in the United States, at the end of the day, and I understand leaving aside the surveillance concerns or the privacy issues, is it's a social media platform that tens of millions, really more than 100 million, I think a third of the population, choose voluntarily to use. Nobody forces them to go onto TikTok. They choose that social media platform as their primary place for forming communion with other people, learning about and expressing political views, organizing politically. It's a place that 1/3 of Americans do use constantly, and especially young people use almost exclusively. So when you say, okay, we're going to take this app that you like most, where you express your political views, or where you get your access to information, and we're going to ban it. We're not going to let you use it. It's no longer going to exist in this country the way X doesn't exist in Brazil. I understand the distinction. But do you see any kind of censorship concerns to that, even if you think the national security problems outweigh it?
I think anytime the government steps in and takes an action that deals with a platform that has that many people on it, where they're exchanging information of the sort that you talked about, it's incumbent on the government officials to be very clear and make the case for it. And I do think, it's fair for people to be concerned. All these people are using it for legitimate purposes, but ultimately, the platform's owners were engaging in conduct, this transfer of data behind the scenes that was a national security problem. Now, again, my ideal outcome here is this thing continues the way it is from a content perspective, and we simply sever that ownership tie so the millions of Americans can continue to be on TikTok. That's what the bill would do. I would hope that that's ultimately where the sort of the TikTok ownership lands. Yeah, I agree with you that people should be concerned. Yeah, I think it's incumbent on us to be very clear about what the risk is and not say, well, I got a secret briefing, I can't tell you. I can tell you the 10 things that gave me pause from a conduct perspective, and I should be able to do that. But again, I can, think that reasonable people could look at all this and say, look, you're drawing a line that I don't think is there. It's too slippery of a slope. I think that's fair. But, I've attempted to sort of, be sensitive to these issues. But when I think something is sort of so on the conduct side and so far from speech or content, that we can take action.
Well, you become a very, I think, important and thoughtful and informed voice in all of these debates, which I really appreciate. I also really appreciate you taking the time to kind of delve into these matters in a deep way. I was thrilled to have you on the show. We'd love to have you on again. Thanks so much for coming on. I hope you have a great evening.
Yeah, really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Absolutely.